It'd be great if all we had to do was start up our planes and take off and fly them. But with all the vibrations that these planes are exposed to, nuts and bolts are going to come loose eventually. And it's way better if we find them on the ground instead of in the air. I know lots of you check prop bolts, and not just when you break a prop, and I'm proud of you for that. But you need to take the cowl off now and then and take a look around inside of there. We got that motor thing in there, and while it's trying to shake everything else apart, it kind of loosens itself up now and then also. Then there's the servos themselves and the servo arms and the linkages. We can't afford to have any of that stuff fall out. There's nothing here that we can let go. All of this stuff needs to be tight. Some of the hardware packages we get today work better at just showing you how cheap the manufacturer can make a hardware package. That's why I keep my own hardware laying around, and I can usually outfit a plane right out of my drawers here. I get most of this stuff from microfasteners.com, and there'll be links to that in the webpage story. On the left are the screws that come with servos that I throw away. On the right are the ones that I actually use, and I heard about these from AeroWorks. The ones on the right are way easier to work with. You can get them a lot tighter, and they stay tight better. And there's links to these in the webpage version of this story. When I'm building a plane, I'll run these servo mounting screws in once, take them back out, put a drop of thin CA on them, and then install them permanently. That hardens up the wood around them, and they get a better grip, but I still check them over every now and then. I saw a Harley-Davidson manual once that said to tighten the crank nut to 2 oomph and a grunt. The servo arm screws are too small for that, so we just go to, and that's enough. When I go through one of my airplanes, I try to tighten up everything that's held in by a screw or bolt. Being a big thinker and all, it occurred to me that it's always going to be the one screw I didn't tighten up that's going to wind up being loose. And right now, if you're not thinking that, well, tighten them all up then, you need to go wait in the bus. There's not a lot of stress on a throttle servo, but if it loosens up, the starting and ending points are going to change. And that means that you're going to go dead stick where it's absolutely the worst possible time. When I'm working in the shop, I break the bolts loose by hand, but then use a drill driver to run them out. It just saves a little time and effort. And make sure you don't have any thread locker or anything else on the flange that the prop rides against. I've seen people fighting their cowl bolts for years with them constantly coming loose or falling out. For just about as long, I've been putting blue thread locker on my cowl bolts so they don't do that. I use the blue thread locker on the exterior cowl bolts as well. And I always use these washers that have rubber bonded on the other side. These spread the load out on the cowl some and seem to help from keep them from backing out. I get these from Micro Fasteners also. When we get the cowl off, there's all kinds of things on here that don't come loose very often but can be really bad when they do, so it's worth the time to check them. The motor mounting bolts should be a no-brainer. As hard as these bolts get shaken, I put a little blue thread locker on these, tighten them up real good, and I hardly ever have them come loose. Muffler bolts are something else that can give you fits, especially with these aluminum mufflers for some reason. Over the years, I've actually found a couple of these cylinder bolts to be a little bit loose, so I always check them too when I'm going through it. All those little screws and bolts on the carburetor need to be good and snug or it's not going to work right. The fuel pump diaphragm is under this cover, and if these bolts loosen up, the engine's either not going to run or it's going to run really bad. And while you're in here, make sure that the throttle linkage is tight and everything's in good shape. I move my throttle stick a lot when I fly, so I always make sure that this linkage is still good and snug and moving freely. The choke linkage is usually dead simple, but if this doesn't work right, it's nothing but frustrating trying to get the motor to start. I ground the end of this wrench down some to make it easier to get at these back bolts on the motor case. These bolts are just as important as anything else on this motor, but a lot of people seem to make believe these ain't there when they go through checking nuts and bolts. I think I spent less than 10 minutes going over all the motor bolts and everything under the cowl, and that's with moving the camera and setting the lights up and everything. This doesn't take long to do. And when I'm putting this stuff back together, I put just a little drop of thread locker on each of the bolts. You don't need a whole lot of it. And after you've done this a little while, you get thread locker built up in the threads and it actually holds a little better yet. The blue tape is where I found a crack in the cowl when I took this apart. I've got that all glassed on the inside and tape's just holding it in place while I put the cowl back on. If you're new to gasoline engines, you want to pull up a chair because we're going to save you some grief here. The big prop washer on the front end of the motor will sink into new props a little bit. We generate a lot of pressure with those bolts. When I put a new prop on a plane, I check these bolts every few flights. You let one or two of these bolts loosen up and this prop can explode at speed. I put a little blue thread lock on each of the bolts and I run them in with the electric gun, but I just run them in until they stop. After I get all 4 of the bolts installed, then I go back around with a hand wrench and tighten them down in sequence. Until you get 2 of the bolts run down, the prop is going to want to cock a little bit to one side or the other, so you don't want to run them down hard. I use this little electric gun because it's handy, and I'm not trying to get these bolts tight when I run them down. I think it's real important to make sure you just seat the bolts with this and then tighten it up by hand. Now with the hand wrench, I'll snug one bolt down, go straight across and do the other bolt and get that snug, and then go back to the ones I missed, tighten that one up, and go across and snug this one down. And I keep going over that pattern, turning the bolt maybe 1/8 of a turn each time. You'll find as you keep doing this that when you come back to the first bolt, it's a little bit loose. But then after a few times around this pattern, you'll come back to the first bolt and won't hardly turn at all. Then you've got it good and seated. We want these bolts putting pressure on that prop washer evenly, and this is a good way to do that. On most planes, you can check all the nuts and bolts in an hour or less. I put the batteries on charge when I started this process, and I'm going to have to come back later when they're done. It's just a good feeling knowing that all the nuts and bolts are tight when you start throwing an airplane around the sky. I like being pretty confident that nothing's going to fly off when you tell the airplane to do something it doesn't especially want to.